A 9-year-old girl testifies against her millionaire adoptive father in court after secretly recording his abuse for months. When the judge hears the audio of what happened to her younger foster siblings, the entire courtroom falls silent. The grandfather clock in the marble foyer of the Blackwood mansion chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through the sprawling corridors of what many considered to be Richmond's most prestigious residence. 9-year-old Delia Caldwell pressed her small frame against the cool mahogany paneling of the main staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched the worn smartphone in her trembling hands. The device, no bigger than a deck of cards, had become her most precious possession over the past 4 months, not because of its technology, but because of the terrible truth it contained. The mansion around her stood as a monument to wealth and success, its 42 rooms spread across 3 floors of architectural grandeur that had been featured in Southern Living magazine twice in the past 3 years. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across hand-painted murals that depicted idyllic family scenes, while Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries cushioned footsteps along marble hallways lined with priceless artwork. Every surface gleamed with the attention of a full-time housekeeping staff, every detail carefully curated to project an image of refined elegance and domestic bliss. But Delia had learned that the most beautiful facades often concealed the darkest secrets, and the Blackwood mansion was a masterpiece of deception. From her hiding spot behind the curved banister of the grand staircase, Delia could see into the main living room where Nathaniel Blackwood sat in his custom-made Italian leather armchair, reading the Wall Street Journal with the same calculated precision he applied to everything in his life. At 42 years old, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made people instinctively defer to his authority. His silver-streaked dark hair was perfectly styled, his custom-tailored suit impeccable even at the end of a long day, and his piercing blue eyes held an intelligence that could be both captivating and terrifying depending on the circumstances. To anyone observing from the outside, Blackwood appeared to be the epitome of American success, a self-made tech billionaire whose innovative cloud computing company, Blackwood Dynamics, had revolutionized data storage for Fortune 500 companies across the globe. His personal net worth exceeded $2 billion. His philanthropic foundation had donated over $50 million to children's charities across Virginia, and his transformation from ruthless businessman to devoted adoptive father had been celebrated in numerous media profiles over the past 3 years. The Richmond Times had featured him on their cover just last month with the headline, "Virginia's most generous bachelor turned family man," complete with a photo of him at a charity gala with Delia, Jasper, and Luna by his side, all of them smiling brightly in their formal attire. The article had praised his decision to adopt 3 children from the foster care system, describing him as a man who had chosen to use his wealth and influence to provide loving homes for children who had lost their biological families. But Delia knew better. She had learned through months of careful observation and heartbreaking secret recordings that Nathaniel Blackwood was a master of deception, whose public facade concealed a calculating predator that thrived in the shadows of his own home. The sound of small footsteps on the marble floor made Delia's stomach clench with familiar dread. 6-year-old twins, Jasper and Luna, appeared at the top of the main staircase, their identical faces bearing the hollow expression that had become their permanent mask over the past year. They moved with the careful synchronization of children who had learned to find safety in each other's presence, their bond forged not through typical sibling rivalry and affection, but through shared trauma and mutual survival. Jasper, with his sandy brown hair neatly combed and his Willowbrook Elementary Academy uniform pressed to crisp perfection, possessed the kind of delicate features that had made him a favorite subject for the professional photographers who documented Blackwood's charitable events. But where once there had been the bright curiosity typical of a 6-year-old boy, now there was only a carefully constructed emptiness, as if he had learned to retreat so deeply within himself that no external force could reach him. Luna, dressed in a pristine blue dress that matched her cornflower eyes, had once been described by their former social worker as a little chatterbox with enough personality to light up a room. That vibrant child had vanished over the past year, replaced by a silent wraith who communicated primarily through meaningful glances shared with her twin brother. Her blonde hair fell in perfect ringlets around her shoulders, maintained by a stylist who visited the mansion twice weekly, but her eyes held the ancient weariness of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and learned that silence was the price of survival. "Children," Blackwood's voice carried across the room with deceptive warmth, each syllable carefully modulated to project paternal affection for any potential observers. "Come here, please." Delia watched as the twins exchanged a look that spoke volumes, a silent communication born from shared trauma and mutual protection. In that brief moment of eye contact, she could see them steeling themselves for whatever ordeal awaited them, drawing strength from their connection, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that this might be one of the evenings when Blackwood's mood turned particularly dark. They descended the stairs with the mechanical obedience of well-trained soldiers, their small bodies rigid with barely contained fear. Each step was measured and deliberate, their feet landing silently on the marble treads in a pattern they had perfected through months of painful trial and error. Any stumble, any sound that might indicate clumsiness or disrespect could trigger an explosion of rage that would result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. As they reached the bottom step, Delia carefully positioned her phone, ensuring that the recording app was active and the device was angled to capture both clear audio and any visual evidence she might need. The worn smartphone, with its cracked screen protector and faded case, had become an extension of her own body over the past 4 months, a lifeline that she carried everywhere despite the constant terror of discovery. This had become her routine, her secret mission, her desperate attempt to document the truth that no adult seemed willing or able to see. Every evening when Blackwood summoned the twins for what he euphemistically called family time, Delia would position herself in one of the mansion's many hiding spots, behind furniture, in doorway alcoves, or in the spaces between rooms where the architecture created natural blind spots and recorded everything that transpired. The phone itself was a relic from a previous era, an older model that had been discarded and forgotten when Blackwood upgraded the household technology systems. Delia had discovered it 4 months ago while exploring the mansion's unused servants' quarters, a section of the house that Blackwood rarely visited and the cleaning staff only attended to once weekly. It had been hidden behind a loose baseboard, wrapped in a cloth and tucked away as if someone had deliberately concealed it. Initially, she had planned to turn the device over to Blackwood, assuming it belonged to one of the former housekeeping staff members who had worked in the mansion before his renovation of the servants' wing. But something had stopped her. Perhaps the same survival instinct that had kept her relatively safe in this house of horrors. Or maybe a subconscious recognition that she had stumbled upon something that could serve as a weapon in her desperate war to protect Jasper and Luna. The phone had become her secret ally, her shield against the gaslighting and manipulation that characterized daily life in the Blackwood mansion. She had taught herself to use its recording functions through careful experimentation, learning to maximize battery life by dimming the screen and disabling unnecessary applications, managing storage space by transferring files to a hidden cloud, account she had created using the mansion's guest Wi-Fi network, and most importantly, figuring out how to record without triggering any notification sounds that might alert Blackwood to her activities. What had started as a desperate attempt to document isolated incidents had evolved into a comprehensive archive of systematic abuse. Over the past 4 months, Delia had recorded more than 60 hours of evidence that revealed the full scope of Blackwood's psychological and physical torture of the twins. She had documented his carefully crafted system of rewards and punishments, his manipulation of their basic needs as tools of control, and his methodical destruction of their sense of self-worth and reality. Jasper, Luna. Blackwood's voice took on the subtle edge that Delia had learned to recognize as a warning signal, the slight sharpening of tone that indicated his patience was wearing thin and the twins were walking into dangerous territory. I received a call from your teacher today. Apparently you've both been unusually quiet in class. Again. The twins stood before him like defendants awaiting sentencing, their hands clasped behind their backs in the precise posture that Blackwood had drilled into them through months of conditioning and for punishment. Delia held her breath, her finger hovering over the phone's screen to ensure the recording was capturing every word. She had learned through painful experience that these initial moments of Blackwood's confrontations were crucial. They established the framework for everything that would follow, revealing his psychological tactics and the systematic way he transformed normal childhood behaviors into crimes worthy of severe consequences. When people ask questions about my children, Blackwood continued, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator sensing opportunity, it reflects poorly on me, on this family, on everything I've built for you, ungrateful little creatures. He began to pace around the twins in a slow circle, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with metronomic precision. This was another element of his psychological warfare, the way he used physical positioning and movement to create a sense of being hunted, trapped, unable to escape his attention or judgment. Do you understand what I've sacrificed to give you this life? He asked, his voice dropping to the conversational tone that somehow carried more menace than if he had shouted. Do you have any comprehension of the resources I've invested in your welfare, your education, your future? Delia's finger trembled as she ensured the recording was capturing every nuance of his performance. She had documented dozens of these speeches over the past 4 months, and she recognized the pattern he was establishing. Blackwood always began his confrontations by positioning himself as the generous benefactor, the long-suffering father figure who had rescued the twins from a fate worse than death, only to be repaid with ingratitude and defiance. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, Jasper whispered, his voice barely audible even in the acoustically perfect room. The words came out as a reflexive response, programmed through months of conditioning to provide the expected acknowledgement of wrongdoing, even when no actual transgression had occurred. Delia could see the effort it took for him to speak at all, the way his small hands trembled behind his back, the slight tremor in his voice that betrayed his terror, the way he had to force himself to make eye contact as Blackwood had trained him to do. Sorry isn't enough, Blackwood replied, his tone suggesting that he had expected this response and found it disappointingly inadequate. Sorry doesn't undo the embarrassment you've caused me in front of your teacher. Sorry doesn't.
Explain why 2 children who have been given every conceivable advantage choose to behave like damaged goods.
He gestured broadly to the opulent surroundings, his movements theatrical, and calculated to emphasize the contrast between their luxurious environment and what he characterized as their ungrateful behavior. The living room itself was a showcase of wealth and refinement. Hand-carved crown molding that had been installed by master craftsmen, original oil paintings by renowned artists, furniture that had been custom designed by the same interior decorator who had worked on the governor's mansion. Look around you, Blackwood commanded, his voice rising slightly as he warmed to his familiar theme. You live in a mansion that most families could never dream of affording. Every piece of furniture in this room costs more than most people earn in a month. The chandelier above your heads is worth more than most people's homes. Luna's small body began to shake almost imperceptibly, and Delia could see tears forming in her blue eyes. The 6-year-old girl had not spoken a single word in over 2 months, her silence serving as both protection and rebellion against the man who controlled every aspect of their lives. Her muteness had become a source of particular frustration for Blackwood, who viewed it as a direct challenge to his authority and a potential red flag for any adults who might interact with her. You attend Willowbrook Elementary Academy, he continued, beginning another slow circuit around the frozen children, where annual tuition costs $45,000 per child. That's $90,000 I invest in your education. Every year, not including the additional fees for your tutoring, your extracurricular activities, your specialized programs. Delia had heard these numbers recited countless times, always delivered with the precision of an accountant presenting A bill for services rendered. Blackwood maintained detailed records of every expense related to the children's care, from their clothing allowances to their medical insurance, and he used these figures as weapons to reinforce their indebtedness to him. "You have trust funds," he went on, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Established with my personal wealth that will ensure your financial security for the rest of your natural lives. Each of you will inherit enough money to live comfortably without ever needing to work, provided you continue to deserve such generosity." The conditional nature of this inheritance was another tool in his arsenal of control. Delia had learned that the trust funds came with extensive legal conditions that gave Blackwood complete discretionary power over their distribution, meaning that any perceived disloyalty or disobedience could result in the children losing their financial security permanently. "And yet," Blackwood said, stopping directly in front of the twins and allowing his voice to drop to a whisper that forced them to strain to hear his words, "you choose to embarrass me with your antisocial behavior. You choose to make your teachers concerned about your welfare. You choose to behave in ways that reflect poorly on my parenting and my reputation. Look at me when I'm speaking to you," he commanded suddenly, his tone snapping back to full volume. Both twins raised their eyes to meet his gaze, and Delia could see the tremendous effort it took for them to comply. She had documented this, patterned dozens of times, Blackwood's insistence on eye contact during his verbal assaults, his use of their gratitude as a weapon, and his systematic destruction of their sense of security and self-worth. What made these confrontations particularly insidious was the way Blackwood combined genuine threats with reasonable-sounding expectations. His demands for polite behavior, academic excellence, and social engagement were the same goals that any caring parent might have for their children. But in his hands, these normal expectations became instruments of torture, impossible standards that the traumatized twins could never hope to meet. "When your teacher asks how you're feeling," Blackwood continued, his eyes boring into each child, "in turn, what is the appropriate response?" "Fine, thank you for asking," Jasper recited automatically, the words coming out in the mechanical cadence of a programmed response. "More enthusiasm," Blackwood snapped. "You're not a robot reading from a script. You're a happy, well-adjusted child in a loving home. Again." "Fine, thank you for asking," Jasper repeated, forcing brightness into his tone that made Delia's heart ache with the recognition of how much effort it took for him to perform this charade of normalcy. "Better, but still not convincing," Blackwood observed critically. "No one will believe that hollow display of emotion. You need to understand that your performance in public is a reflection of this family's reputation. When you fail to meet expectations, you're not just disappointing me, you're endangering everything we've built together." He turned his attention to Luna, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, her small body trembling with the effort of containing her fear and distress. "Luna, show me your smile," he commanded. Luna's lips curved upward in a gesture that was more grimace than smile, her eyes remaining lifeless despite the forced expression. The contrast between her mechanical facial expression and her obvious terror was heartbreaking, and Delia had to bite her lip to prevent herself from crying out in protest. "Pathetic," Blackwood muttered, shaking his head in theatrical disappointment. "No one will believe that hollow display. You look like you're in pain rather than expressing joy." Again. Luna tried to comply, her small face contorting as she attempted to produce a more convincing smile, while tears began to stream down her cheeks. The sight of her struggling to perform happiness, while clearly in distress, was one of the most disturbing things Delia had ever witnessed, and she had to grip her phone tighter to keep her hands steady as she continued recording. "Stop crying," Blackwood ordered sharply. "Tears are manipulation, Luna. Tears are what weak people use when they don't want to take responsibility for their failures. Dry your eyes and try again." This continued for nearly an hour, with Blackwood drilling the twins on appropriate responses to every conceivable question they might encounter from teachers, classmates' parents, or other adults in their social circle. He covered scenarios ranging from casual inquiries about their weekend activities to more probing questions about their home life and their relationship with their adoptive father. "If someone asks whether you're happy living here, what do you say?" he would demand. "I love my home, and I'm grateful for everything Mr. Blackwood has given me," they would respond in unison. "If someone asks about your biological parents, I'm sad that they died, but Mr. Blackwood has been a wonderful father to me. If someone notices that you seem quiet or withdrawn, I'm just naturally shy, but I'm working on being more outgoing." Each response had been carefully crafted to deflect concern while reinforcing the narrative of Blackwood as a loving, devoted parent. Delia's phone captured it all: the systematic coaching designed to prevent detection of abuse, the psychological conditioning that transformed natural trauma responses into performed compliance, and the methodical destruction of two young children's authentic emotional expression. But perhaps most disturbing was the way Blackwood punctuated these rehearsals with subtle physical intimidation. He would stand too close to the children, invading their personal space in ways that made them visibly uncomfortable. He would place his hands on their shoulders with pressure that looked affectionate to an observer but was clearly painful to the recipients. He would adjust their posture with grips that left temporary marks on their arms, all while maintaining the facade of a caring father helping his children present themselves properly. "Remember," he said as the session finally began to wind down, "your behavior outside this house is a direct reflection of my parenting. When you make people concerned about your welfare, you're essentially telling the world that I'm failing as a father. Is that what you want to communicate?" "No, Mr. Blackwood," the twins replied together, their voices hollow and exhausted. "Good. Then I trust that tomorrow's school day will be different. I trust that your teacher will have no reason to call me with concerns about your participation or your mood. I trust that you'll remember everything we've practiced tonight." As the confrontation finally concluded, Blackwood dismissed the twins with instructions to complete their homework and prepare for bed. They fled the room with the desperate haste of prey escaping a predator, their small bodies nearly trembling with relief at being released from his presence. Delia knew that within minutes they would be huddled together in one of their bedrooms, seeking comfort in each other's presence while processing the trauma of another evening in their adoptive father's control. She had witnessed their post-confrontation rituals through carefully positioned recording sessions, the way they would hold each other until their trembling stopped, the whispered reassurances they would exchange, the silent tears they would shed until exhaustion finally allowed them to sleep. "Delia, remain here," Blackwood instructed, settling back into his leather chair and reaching for the crystal decanter of bourbon that he kept on the side table. She obeyed, her mind racing as she wondered what he wanted to discuss. These private conversations had become more frequent over the past few months, and she suspected that he was grooming her to serve as his primary witness, should anyone ever question the twins' welfare or his parenting methods. The living room felt different once the twins had left, larger somehow, as if their small presence had been the only thing keeping the space from becoming completely overwhelming. Delia stood in the center of the room, acutely aware of her isolation and vulnerability, while Blackwood poured himself a generous measure of bourbon and took a slow, contemplative sip. "You're doing well in school," he observed, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass while studying her with the same calculating attention he had directed at the twins. "Miss Whitmore speaks very highly of your academic performance." The mention of her teacher's name sent a jolt of longing through Delia's chest. Catherine Whitmore was the one adult in her life who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being, who asked thoughtful questions about her interests and feelings, who created moments of safety and normalcy in an otherwise terrifying world. Miss Whitmore's classroom had become a sanctuary where Delia could almost forget the horrors waiting for her at home, where she could focus on learning and growing without the constant fear of making a mistake that would result in punishment. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Delia replied carefully, understanding that any discussion of her teacher required extreme caution. "She's also mentioned some concerns about your concentration levels," he continued, his tone remaining conversational, but carrying an undercurrent of warning that made Delia's blood run cold. Apparently, you seem distracted during certain activities, preoccupied with matters outside the classroom. Delia's worst fears were being confirmed. Her teacher's innocent observations and caring attention were being interpreted as potential threats to Blackwood's carefully maintained facade. Miss Whitmore's kindness and perceptiveness were exactly the qualities that made her dangerous in Blackwood's estimation. She was too caring, too observant, too likely to notice signs of distress that other adults might overlook or dismiss. "I'll try to focus better," Delia promised, understanding that this was both an expectation and a barely veiled threat. "See that you do," Blackwood replied, his piercing blue eyes never leaving her face as he studied her reaction with the intensity of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. "Miss Whitmore seems quite fond of you. She speaks of you with genuine affection, almost as if she considers you to be something more than just another student in her classroom." The way he emphasized certain words made it clear that he viewed the teacher's attention as suspicious, potentially problematic. Delia realized with growing terror that her one source of comfort and stability was being identified as a threat that might need to be eliminated. "It would be unfortunate," Blackwood continued, taking another slow sip of his bourbon, "if that relationship became complicated by unnecessary concerns or misunderstandings. Miss Whitmore is a dedicated educator, but she's also young and perhaps somewhat naive about the complexities of family dynamics." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Delia understood that any sign of distress or unusual behavior that might prompt her teacher to ask probing questions would result in consequences for not just herself, but for Jasper and Luna as well. Blackwood was making it clear that he viewed Miss Whitmore's attention as a potential problem that would need to be managed, possibly by removing Delia from her classroom or finding other ways to limit their interaction. "I understand," she said, the words barely audible as she struggled to maintain her composure while her world seemed to crumble around her. "Excellent. You're a smart girl, Delia. Much smarter than your siblings, which is why I know you'll make the right choices going forward. Intelligence is a gift, but it can also be a burden if not used wisely." As she was finally dismissed and made her way upstairs to her bedroom, Delia's mind was already working frantically on the implications of this conversation. The warning about Miss Whitmore had made it clear that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. If she was going to take action, if she was going to find a way to save Jasper and Luna and herself, it would have to be soon. Her bedroom, decorated in soft pastels and filled with expensive toys and books that she rarely had time to enjoy, felt like a beautiful prison. The room itself was a masterpiece of interior design, with custom furniture that had been featured in decorating magazines and artwork that had been selected by professional consultants. But despite its beauty, it was still a cage, monitored and controlled like every other aspect of their lives in the mansion. She sat at her antique writing desk, ostensibly working on homework, while actually reviewing the day's recordings and planning her documentation strategy for the coming days. The smartphone, now hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary that Blackwood would never think to examine, contained over 60 hours of recorded evidence spanning 4 months of systematic abuse. The files were organized by date and type of incident, with detailed notes about the context and participants involved in each recording. Delia had learned to identify patterns in Blackwood's behavior, to predict when the worst incidents were likely to occur based on his mood and external stressors, and to position herself strategically to capture the most damning evidence while maintaining her cover as the obedient, grateful adopted daughter. But as she sat in her gilded cage, listening to the muffled sounds of the twins crying themselves to sleep in the room next door, Delia knew that simply collecting evidence was no longer enough. The weight of their suffering, combined with the growing threat to her relationship with Miss Whitmore, was forcing her toward a decision that terrified her more than anything Blackwood had ever done. She was going to have to find the courage to break her silence and trust someone with the truth. And that someone, she was beginning to realize, would have to be the one adult who had shown her what genuine care and concern looked like. Her teacher, Catherine Whitmore. The decision filled her with a complex mixture of hope and terror. Hope because Miss Whitmore represented the possibility of rescue, of adult intervention that could finally end their nightmare. Terror because she understood the enormous risk she would be taking, not just for herself but for Jasper and Luna as well. If Blackwood discovered her betrayal, if her plan failed, the consequences would be more severe than anything they had endured so far. As she closed her textbook and prepared for bed, Delia whispered a prayer into the darkness of her room, not for her own salvation, but for the strength to save Jasper and Luna before Blackwood's systematic destruction of their spirits became irreversible. She prayed for wisdom to know when and how to approach Miss Whitmore, for courage to overcome her terror of Blackwood's retaliation, and for the protection of the two innocent children who depended on her for their survival. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times as the mansion settled into its deceptive quiet, the sound echoing through corridors that held so many terrible secrets. Delia fell asleep, clutching the dictionary that contained her hidden weapon, knowing that the evidence she had gathered over 4 months would soon need to see the light of day, regardless of the personal cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to document Blackwood's crimes, and perhaps most importantly, new chances to find the courage she would need to take the most important step of her young life. The time for silent observation was coming to an end, and the time for action was rapidly approaching. In her dreams that night, Delia imagined a world where children were safe, where adults protected the innocent instead of preying upon them, and where the truth was powerful, enough to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. It was a beautiful dream, and one that she was determined to make reality, no matter what it cost her. 4 months earlier, on a cold February morning when frost still clung to the windows of the Blackwood mansion, 9-year-old Delia Caldwell had made a discovery that would change the trajectory of her life and potentially save the lives of 2 innocent children. The memory of that pivotal day remained etched in her mind with crystalline clarity, each detail preserved with the precision that only trauma and desperation could provide. It had been a Saturday, one of those endless winter weekends when Blackwood's mood grew particularly dark and unpredictable. The twins had been in his care for 8 months at that point, and the systematic destruction of their spirits had already begun in earnest. Delia remembered the way they had started flinching whenever adults approached them, the way their laughter had gradually faded from the mansion's halls, and most disturbingly, the way they had begun to communicate primarily through frightened glances and whispered conversations that ceased whenever Blackwood entered a room. On that particular morning, Blackwood had left early for a business meeting in Washington, D.C., providing Delia with a rare opportunity to explore the mansion, without fear of encountering his unpredictable temperament. She had been searching for a quiet place to read, somewhere away from the twins' bedroom, where their muffled sobs had become a constant soundtrack to life in the supposedly perfect home. The servants' quarters occupied the entire east wing of the mansion's 2nd floor, a section that had been largely abandoned since Blackwood's renovation project had modernized the main living areas. These rooms, once bustling with the activity of a full household staff, now stood empty and forgotten, their outdated decor and cramped dimensions incompatible with Blackwood's vision of contemporary luxury. Delia had ventured into what appeared to be a former maid's room, attracted by the large window that overlooked the mansion's formal gardens. The space was small but oddly comforting, with faded floral wallpaper and simple wooden furniture that stood in stark contrast to the opulent excess that characterized the rest of the house. As she settled into the window seat with her book, she noticed that one of the baseboards appeared to be loose, creating a small gap between the wall and the wooden trim. Curiosity overcoming caution, she had pried at the loose section until it came away entirely, revealing a hidden compartment that had been carved into the wall itself. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth napkin, she found the smartphone that would become her secret weapon in the war to save Jasper and Luna. The device was several generations old, its case worn smooth from years of use, but it still held a charge and functioned perfectly despite its age. There was no way to determine who had hidden it or why, but Delia suspected it had belonged to one of the former staff members who had worked in the mansion before Blackwood's arrival. Perhaps it had been forgotten during a hasty departure, or maybe someone had deliberately concealed it as a backup communication device. At first, she had intended to turn the phone over to Blackwood, assuming it was lost property that should be returned to its rightful owner. But something had stopped. An instinct so profound that it seemed to come from somewhere beyond her conscious mind. Instead, she had carefully rewrapped the device and returned it to its hiding place, telling herself she would decide what to do with it later. That evening, her decision had been made for her in the most horrific way possible. She had been completing homework in her bedroom when she heard Luna's scream echo through the mansion's corridors, a sound of pure terror and pain that seemed to pierce straight through her heart. The scream was followed by Jasper's voice, high and desperate, pleading for Blackwood to stop, to please not hurt his sister anymore. Delia had crept from her room and positioned herself at the top of the main staircase, where she could see into the living room without being detected. What she witnessed that night would haunt her dreams for months to come and provide the motivation she needed to begin her secret documentation campaign. Blackwood had the 6-year-old Luna bent over his knee, her small body convulsing with sobs as he delivered blow after methodical blow to her back and legs with what appeared to be a leather belt. Each strike was calculated and precise, designed to cause maximum pain without leaving marks that would be visible when she was clothed. Jasper stood nearby, tears streaming down his face as he watched his twin sister's torment, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides as he struggled, with the impossible choice between intervening and making the situation worse. "This is what happens," Blackwood had said in a conversational tone, as if he were discussing the weather rather than torturing a small child, "when children forget their place in this household. This is what happens when ungrateful little creatures think they can disobey me without consequences." Luna's crime had been refusing to eat her dinner, a plate of vegetables that she found particularly distasteful. In any normal household, such a minor act of childish defiance might have resulted in a gentle scolding or perhaps an early bedtime. In the Blackwood mansion, it had triggered a response so disproportionate and brutal that Delia could barely comprehend what she was witnessing. "Please," Jasper had whispered, his voice breaking with desperation. "Please don't hurt Luna anymore. I'll eat her vegetables. I'll eat anything you want. Just please stop." "You'll eat your own dinner and remain silent," Blackwood had replied without pausing in his assault on Luna's small body. "Or you'll join your sister in learning this lesson about gratitude and obedience." The beating had continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Each blow accompanied by Blackwood's calm recitation of the twins' supposed failures and ingratitude. He spoke of the money he had spent on their care, the opportunities he had provided, the comfortable life they enjoyed, all while systematically brutalizing a 6-year-old child who weighed less than 50 pounds. When it was finally over, when Luna's screams had faded to whimpers and her small body had gone limp with exhaustion and shock, Blackwood had set her on her feet with the same casual indifference he might show when moving a piece of furniture. "Clean yourself up," he had instructed, straightening his tie as if nothing unusual had occurred. "We have dinner guests coming tomorrow evening, and I expect both of you to be charming and well-behaved. Any sign of tonight's lesson, any indication that you've been disciplined, will result in consequences that will make this evening seem pleasant by comparison." Delia had retreated to her room in a state of shock so profound that she could barely process what she had witnessed. The casual brutality, the calculated nature of the abuse, the way Blackwood had transformed a minor childhood transgression into justification for torture, it all seemed too monstrous to be real. But the next morning, when she saw Luna moving carefully to avoid aggravating her injuries, when she noticed the way Jasper hovered protectively near his sister, when she observed how both twins flinched away from any sudden movements, she knew that the nightmare was not only real, but likely to be repeated again and again. That was when she had retrieved the hidden smartphone and begun her secret mission. Learning to use the device had been a challenge that required patience, creativity, and careful attention to detail. The phone's operating system was older than what she was accustomed to, and many of the applications were unfamiliar to her. But desperation had been a powerful motivator, and within a few days she had mastered the basics of audio and video recording. The first challenge had been power management. The phone's battery was old and didn't hold a charge for extended periods, which meant she had to be strategic about when and how she used it. She had solved this problem by locating the original charging cable in a drawer in the servants' quarters and establishing a charging station in her hiding spot, where she could keep the device powered without risking discovery. Storage space had been another concern. High-quality audio and video recordings consumed significant amounts of memory, and she couldn't risk running out of space during a critical documentation session. After some experimentation, she had discovered that she could create a hidden cloud storage account using the mansion's guest Wi-Fi network, allowing her to upload files remotely and free up space on the device itself. But the most critical skill she had to develop was the ability to record without being detected. The phone's notification sounds had to be disabled completely, the screen brightness reduced to its minimum setting, and the device positioned in ways that would capture clear audio while remaining invisible to Blackwood's searching gaze. Her first successful recording had been made 3 days after Luna's beating, when Blackwood had subjected both twins to what he called a gratitude session, a psychological torture technique where he forced them to recite detailed lists of everything they should be thankful for while he criticized their tone, their sincerity, and their attitude. "I am grateful for my comfortable bed," Jasper had been required to say, his voice hollow and mechanical. "More enthusiasm," Blackwood had demanded. "You sound like you're reading from a script rather than expressing genuine appreciation." Again. "I am grateful for my comfortable bed," Jasper had repeated, forcing brightness into his tone that made Delia's heart ache. Better, but still not convincing. You need to understand that gratitude is not just about words, it's about attitude, about behavior, about demonstrating through your actions that you truly appreciate what you've been given. Again. This had continued for over an hour, with both twins required to express gratitude for dozens of aspects of their lives in the mansion, from their expensive clothing to their private tutoring sessions to their trust funds. Each expression of thanks had to meet Blackwood's exacting standards for sincerity and enthusiasm, and any perceived lack of conviction resulted in repetition and increasingly harsh criticism. Delia's recording of that session had been technically imperfect. The audio quality was inconsistent, and she had struggled to maintain a steady position while holding the phone, but it had captured the essential horror of Blackwood's psychological manipulation. More importantly, it had proven that her plan was feasible, that she could document his crimes without being detected. Over the following weeks, she had refined her technique and expanded her documentation efforts. She learned to predict when confrontations were likely to occur based on Blackwood's mood and schedule, positioning herself strategically before the twins were summoned for their regular ordeals. She developed a system for categorizing and organizing her recordings, creating detailed notes about the context and participants involved in each incident. By the end of March, she had documented over 20 hours of systematic abuse, ranging from psychological torture sessions like the gratitude exercises to physical punishment that left the twins bruised and traumatized. Each recording added another piece to the horrifying puzzle of Blackwood's carefully constructed system of control and manipulation. But it was during this same period that Delia began to notice changes in her own behavior that would eventually draw the attention of the one adult who might be able to help her, her teacher, Miss Catherine Whitmore. Catherine Whitmore was 34 years old, with shoulder-length auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to notice everything that happened in her fourth-grade classroom at Willowbrook Elementary Academy. She had been teaching for 8 years, but her connection with children seemed to go beyond professional training. There was something in her manner, a combination of genuine warmth and protective instinct, that made even the most reserved students feel safe in her presence. What Delia didn't know at the time was that Miss Whitmore's special sensitivity to signs of distress in children came from her own traumatic childhood experiences. At the age of 7, Catherine had lost both parents in a house fire and had been placed in the foster care system, where she had spent the next 11 years moving between homes of varying quality and safety. Some of her foster families had been kind and supportive, providing the stability and care she needed during the most vulnerable period of her life. Others had been indifferent at best, treating her as an unwelcome burden rather than a child in need of love and protection. Her experiences in foster care had given her an almost supernatural ability to recognize the signs of abuse and neglect in the children she taught. She could identify the subtle behavioral changes that indicated a child was struggling with trauma, the way they carried themselves when they felt unsafe, the particular quality of silence that came from fear rather than simple shyness. In early March, Miss Whitmore began to notice changes in Delia's classroom behavior that set off every internal alarm she possessed. The girl, who had been one of her most engaged and enthusiastic students, was becoming withdrawn and distracted, often staring out the window during lessons or appearing to be lost in thought during group activities. More concerning were the physical signs of stress that Miss Whitmore observed with her trained eye. Delia had developed dark circles under her eyes that suggested chronic sleep deprivation, and she had lost weight in a way that indicated loss of appetite rather than normal growth patterns. Her academic performance remained excellent, but her participation in class discussions had diminished significantly, and she seemed to be making a conscious effort to avoid drawing attention to herself. Most troubling of all was the way Delia had begun to react to unexpected sounds or sudden movements in the classroom. A dropped book or a raised voice would cause her to startle violently, her entire body tensing as if preparing for some anticipated blow. These responses suggested a level of hypervigilance that Miss Whitmore recognized from her own childhood, the constant state of alertness that came from living in an environment where danger could materialize without warning. During recess periods, Miss Whitmore observed that Delia had begun to isolate herself from her classmates, choosing to spend her free time reading alone rather than participating in the social activities that had once brought her joy. When other children approached her with invitations to play or attempts at conversation, she would respond politely but briefly, as if she were conserving her emotional energy for more critical purposes. Perhaps most significantly, Miss Whitmore noticed that Delia had become intensely protective of the younger children in the school, particularly those who showed signs of shyness or vulnerability. During lunch periods, she would often be found sitting with first and second graders who seemed isolated or upset, offering comfort and support with a maturity that was both admirable and concerning in a 9-year-old child. This protective behavior extended to her interactions with her own foster siblings when they occasionally crossed paths during school events. Miss Whitmore had observed Delia with the 6-year-old twins during a school assembly, noting the way she positioned herself between them and the crowd of adults, the careful attention she paid to their emotional state, and the subtle ways she seemed to be coaching them on appropriate responses to adult questions. The twins themselves presented their own set of concerning signs that reinforced Miss Whitmore's growing suspicions about the Blackwood household. Though they were not in her classroom, she had observed them during school-wide activities and had spoken with their teachers about their adjustment to their new school environment. Jasper and Luna had been enrolled at Willowbrook Academy in September, shortly after their placement in Blackwood's home, and their teachers had initially been optimistic about their prospects for academic and social success. Both children were clearly intelligent, and their academic records from their previous school had indicated normal developmental progress. However, by November, both teachers had begun to express concerns about the twins' increasingly withdrawn behavior and their apparent reluctance to participate in classroom activities. They rarely spoke unless directly questioned, and even then, their responses were brief and carefully neutral. They seemed to be constantly monitoring their environment for potential threats, and they displayed an unusual level of anxiety around authority figures. Most disturbing was their reaction to any form of correction or criticism, no matter how gentle. A mild suggestion about improving their handwriting or a request to speak more loudly during class presentations would cause them to become visibly upset, often to the point of tears. Their teachers had learned to approach them with extraordinary, care, using the softest possible tone and the most encouraging language, but even these adaptations didn't seem to alleviate their obvious distress. During parent-teacher conferences in October, Blackwood had been charming and concerned, expressing appropriate worry about the twins' adjustment difficulties and requesting specific strategies for helping them feel more comfortable in their new environment. He had spoken eloquently about the challenges of adopting children from difficult backgrounds, demonstrating what appeared to be genuine commitment to their welfare and development. But Miss Whitmore, with her trained eye and personal experience, had noticed subtle inconsistencies in his presentation that raised red flags. His concern seemed performative rather than authentic, as if he were playing the role of a caring parent rather than actually experiencing parental worry. More significantly, she had observed the twins' behavior when Blackwood was present, the way they seemed to shrink into themselves, the careful attention they paid to his mood and expressions, and the obvious relief they showed when he finally left them alone. By December, Miss Whitmore had begun to suspect that something was seriously wrong in the Blackwood household, but she had no concrete evidence to support her concerns. The children were well-dressed and well-fed, their academic performance was adequate despite their behavioral issues, and Nathaniel Blackwood's reputation in the community was impeccable. Any accusations based solely on her intuitive concerns would likely be dismissed as overreach by a well-meaning but misguided teacher. It was during this period of growing concern that Miss Whitmore had begun to pay special attention to Delia, recognizing that the older child might hold the key to understanding what was happening to all three children in their supposedly loving home.
She had started creating opportunities for private conversations with Delia, offering extra help with assignments that the girl didn't actually need, and encouraging her to stay after class for discussions about books and academic interests. These
conversations had been carefully structured to avoid direct questions about home life, while still providing Delia with opportunities to share any concerns she might have. Miss Whitmore had talked about her own childhood experiences in general terms, sharing stories about the importance of trusted adults and the ways that children could seek help when they felt unsafe or overwhelmed. But Delia, despite her obvious trust and affection for her teacher, had remained carefully guarded in these interactions. She would respond enthusiastically to discussions about academic subjects and would occasionally share details about her interests and hobbies. But she never volunteered information about her home life or her relationship with Blackwood and the twins. Miss Whitmore had recognized this pattern from her own childhood, the careful compartmentalization that allowed a child to function normally in safe environments while concealing the trauma they experienced elsewhere. She had done the same thing during her years in foster care, presenting a cheerful and well-adjusted facade at school while enduring neglect and occasional abuse in her placement homes. The breakthrough that Miss Whitmore had been hoping for came in late March during what should have been a routine afternoon of additional tutoring. She had asked Delia to stay after class to discuss a creative writing assignment, but the real purpose of the session was to provide another opportunity for private conversation in the safety of her classroom. As they worked through Delia's essay, a beautifully written piece about the importance of family loyalty, Miss Whitmore had noticed that the girl seemed more agitated than usual. She was having difficulty concentrating, and her responses to questions were brief and distracted. Most concerning of all, she kept checking the clock on the wall with obvious anxiety, as if she were worried about being late for some important appointment. "Is everything all right, Delia?" Miss Whitmore had asked gently. "You seem worried about something." "I'm fine, Miss Whitmore," Delia had replied automatically, but her voice lacked conviction, and she continued to glance nervously at the clock. "You know," Miss Whitmore had said carefully, "sometimes when I was your age, I would worry about things at home, about whether the adults in my life would be upset if I was late, or if I didn't do exactly what they expected me to do." This had been as close as she dared come to a direct inquiry about Delia's home situation, and she had watched carefully for the girl's reaction. What she saw had confirmed her worst fears, a flash of recognition and terror that crossed Delia's face before she could control her expression. "I really do need to go," Delia had said, gathering her books with obvious haste. "Mr. Blackwood expects me home by 4:30, and if I'm late—" She had stopped herself before completing the sentence, but the implication had hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Miss Whitmore had recognized the tone, the same fear she had heard in her own voice as a child when she had been living with foster parents who demanded absolute compliance with their arbitrary rules and schedules. "Of course," Miss Whitmore had said, helping Delia pack her backpack while mentally cataloguing this new piece of evidence about the Blackwood household's dynamics. "I wouldn't want you to be late. But Delia, I want you to know that if you ever need to talk about anything at all, I'm here for you. Sometimes it helps to have a trusted adult to confide in." Delia had paused at the classroom door, her hand on the handle, and for a moment Miss Whitmore had thought she might finally open up about whatever was troubling her. But after a long moment of internal struggle, she had simply nodded and hurried from the room, leaving her teacher with a growing sense of urgency about the situation. That evening, Miss Whitmore had gone home to her small apartment and spent hours researching child abuse recognition and reporting procedures. She had pulled out her old textbooks from her education courses, reviewed online resources about trauma symptoms in children, and examined the legal requirements for mandatory reporting by teachers and school personnel. What she learned had both encouraged and frustrated her. The behavioral signs she had observed in all 3 Blackwood children were consistent with various forms of abuse and neglect, and her professional training gave her both the authority and the responsibility to investigate further. However, she also understood that accusations against someone of Blackwood's wealth and social standing would require substantial evidence to be taken seriously by authorities. Over the following weeks, Miss Whitmore had intensified her observation and documentation efforts, keeping detailed notes about the children's behavior and any statements they made that might provide insight into their home situation. She had also begun reaching out to their other teachers, school counselors, and support staff to gather additional perspectives on their development and adjustment. Meanwhile, Delia had continued her own secret documentation campaign, unaware that her teacher was conducting a parallel investigation driven by the same concerns and protective instincts. Her recordings had grown more sophisticated and comprehensive as she learned to anticipate Blackwood's patterns and position herself strategically to capture the most damaging evidence. By April, she had documented over 40 hours of systematic abuse, including incidents that would later prove to be crucial in building the legal case against Blackwood. She had recorded his training sessions, where he coached the twins on appropriate responses to adult questions, his psychological torture techniques designed to break down their sense of self-worth, and most damning of all, the physical punishments that left them injured and traumatized. Each recording had been carefully catalogued and stored in her secret cloud account, creating a comprehensive archive that revealed the full scope of Blackwood's crimes against the innocent children in his care. But as the evidence mounted, so did Delia's sense of isolation and the crushing weight of responsibility she carried. She was no longer just a child trying to survive in an abusive household. She had become the secret chronicler of systematic torture, the only witness willing and able to document the truth about what happened behind the closed doors of the Blackwood mansion. The smartphone had given her power, but it had also burdened her with knowledge that no 9-year-old should have to bear. As spring arrived and the school year moved toward its conclusion, both Delia and Miss Whitmore were approaching the same inevitable realization. The time for silent observation and careful documentation was coming to an end. The evidence was mounting, the children were suffering, and action would soon need to be taken, regardless of the personal cost or professional risk involved. Neither of them knew that their separate investigations were about to converge in a moment that would change all of their lives forever, setting in motion events that would ultimately bring justice to the children who had suffered in silence for far too long. The stage was being set for a confrontation between truth and power, between the innocent and their oppressors, and between a system designed to protect children and the predators who exploited its weaknesses. The smartphone hidden in Delia's room contained the evidence that could destroy Nathaniel Blackwood's carefully constructed facade, but first, she would need to find the courage to share that evidence with the one adult who had shown her what genuine care and protection looked like. The months of silent courage were about to give way to the most important conversation of her young life, and the fate of 3 children would hang in the balance of that crucial moment of trust and revelation. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Miss Whitmore's 4th grade classroom at Willowbrook Elementary Academy, casting long shadows across the empty desks and colorful educational posters that lined the walls. It was a Thursday in late April, and the school building had settled into its familiar after-hours quiet, with most students and faculty having departed for the day. Only a few dedicated teachers remained, catching up on grading or preparing lessons for the following day. Catherine Whitmore sat at her desk, ostensibly reviewing spelling tests from her morning class, but her attention was focused entirely on the 9-year-old girl who sat across from her, carefully organizing her backpack with the methodical precision that had become her trademark over the past few months. Delia Caldwell appeared to be preparing to leave, just as she had done dozens of times during their after-school tutoring sessions. But something about her demeanor today suggested that this evening would be different. For weeks, Miss Whitmore had been creating these opportunities for private conversation, hoping that Delia would eventually feel safe enough to share whatever was troubling her. The signs of distress had become increasingly obvious. The dark circles under her eyes, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, the protective behavior she displayed toward her younger foster siblings, and most concerning of all, the growing anxiety she showed about returning home each afternoon. "Delia," Miss Whitmore said gently, setting down her red pen and giving the girl her full attention, "you seem particularly worried about something today. Is everything all right at home?" It was a more direct question than she had asked before, but Miss Whitmore sensed that their window of opportunity was closing. Her documentation of the behavioral changes in all 3 Blackwood children had reached a point where she would soon be professionally obligated to file a formal report with Child Protective Services, regardless of whether she had concrete evidence to support her suspicions. Delia's hands stilled on the zipper of her backpack, and Miss Whitmore could see the internal struggle playing out across her young face. For a long moment, the only sound in the classroom was the distant hum of the school's ventilation system and the occasional footstep in the hallway outside. "Miss Whitmore," Delia finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if someone was hurting children and another child knew about it, what should that child do?" The question hit Miss Whitmore like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears, while simultaneously filling her with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because Delia was finally ready to talk, and terror because the hypothetical nature of the question suggested that the situation was even more serious than she had imagined. "Well," Miss Whitmore replied carefully, moving from behind her desk to sit in the chair beside Delia, making herself physically smaller and less intimidating. That would be a very brave child for even thinking about telling a trusted adult. And that child should know that it's never their fault when adults hurt children, and that telling the truth about dangerous situations is always the right thing to do. Delia nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on her hands as they twisted together in her lap. Miss Whitmore could see that she was wrestling with a decision of enormous magnitude, one that would require more courage than most adults ever had to summon. "What if," Delia continued, still speaking in hypotheticals, "what if that child had been watching and recording what was happening? Would that be wrong? Would adults believe them, or would they think the child was lying?" Miss Whitmore's heart nearly stopped at the word recording. The implications of what Delia was suggesting were staggering. Not just that she had witnessed abuse, but that she had been systematically documenting it. The intelligence and courage required for such an undertaking by a 9-year-old child was almost beyond comprehension. Recording evidence of dangerous situations would be extremely smart and brave, Miss Whitmore said, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the turmoil she was feeling internally. And any adult who saw that kind of evidence would have to believe it because recordings don't lie. They show exactly what happened. Delia looked up for the first time, her brown eyes meeting Miss Whitmore's green ones with an intensity that seemed far too mature for a child her age. In that gaze, Miss Whitmore could see months of accumulated trauma, desperate hope, and a burden of responsibility that no child should ever have to carry. "Miss Whitmore," Delia said, abandoning the pretense of hypothetical questions, "I need to show you something. But if I do, everything is going to change. And I'm scared that if I tell the truth, Mr. Blackwood will hurt Jasper and Luna even worse than he already has." The confirmation of her suspicions sent a chill through Miss Whitmore's entire body, but her years of training in child psychology and her own experiences as a foster child helped her maintain her composure. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the breakthrough that could save 3 children from ongoing abuse, and she knew that her response would determine whether Delia found the courage to continue. "Delia, sweetheart," Miss Whitmore said, reaching out to gently touch the girl's hand, "I want you to know that I believe you, and I'm going to help you protect Jasper and Luna. Sometimes keeping secrets about dangerous things makes them more dangerous, not less. When we shine light on bad situations, it makes it harder for bad people to keep hurting others." Delia stared at her teacher for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of doubt or disbelief. What she saw instead was unwavering support and a strength that reminded her of her own determination to protect the twins. Slowly, she reached into her backpack and withdrew the hollowed-out dictionary that had served as her secret hiding place for the past 4 months. "This is going to be hard to watch," Delia warned as she carefully extracted the worn smartphone from its concealment. "Some of it is really bad. But I thought that if adults could see what really happens when no one else is around, maybe they would finally believe us." Miss Whitmore accepted the phone with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that she was holding evidence that could change everything for these children. The device was older than she had expected, its case worn smooth from months of careful handling, but when Delia showed her how to access the recordings, she could see that it contained an extensive archive of files organized by date and type. "There are over 50 hours of recordings," Delia explained, her voice growing steadier as she shifted into the role of teacher, explaining the system she had developed over months of careful documentation. "I started with just audio recordings, but then I learned how to do video too, when I could position the phone where it wouldn't be seen." Miss Whitmore selected one of the earlier files, dated from February, and pressed play with a sense of trepidation that nothing in her professional training had prepared her for. What she heard in the first few seconds of audio made her understand that she was about to witness something that would fundamentally change her understanding of human cruelty. Blackwood's voice came through the phone's speaker with crystalline clarity, his tone conversational and calm as he explained to the twins why their punishment was necessary and justified. But it was the sound of the children's suffering, Luna's terrified whimpers, Jasper's desperate pleas for mercy, and most heartbreakingly, Delia's own quiet sobs as she recorded their torment, that made Miss Whitmore realize she was listening to evidence of systematic torture. "I'm sorry," Delia said, reaching to stop the recording as she saw the color drain from her teacher's face. "I know it's awful. I know it's hard to listen to, but I didn't know what else to do. No one would believe us if we just told them what was happening." "No, don't apologize," Miss Whitmore said firmly, though her voice was thick with emotion. "You did exactly the right thing, Delia. You did something incredibly brave and smart, and because of your courage, we're going to be able to help Jasper and Luna." She set the phone down on her desk and turned to face Delia fully, recognizing that this conversation would require all of her professional skills and personal strength. The child sitting before her had been carrying an impossible burden for months, serving as both victim and witness while developing a sophisticated understanding of legal evidence that would impress seasoned investigators. "I need you to know," Miss Whitmore continued, "that what you've done, documenting this evidence, protecting your siblings, surviving in that environment, shows a kind of courage that most adults never have to demonstrate. You saved their lives, Delia. And now we're going to make sure all three of you are safe. As they talked, Miss Whitmore learned the full scope of what Delia had endured and accomplished over the past 4 months. The systematic nature of Blackwood's abuse, the psychological manipulation he used to maintain control, the way he had positioned Delia as a witness to ensure the twins' compliance. It painted a picture of calculated cruelty that was more disturbing than anything she had encountered in her years of teaching or her own experiences in foster care. But perhaps most remarkable was Delia's strategic thinking and careful planning. She had taught herself to predict Blackwood's patterns, to position recording equipment for optimal evidence collection, and to maintain her cover as the obedient adopted daughter while secretly building a case that could destroy him. Her understanding of what would constitute compelling evidence for adults showed a sophistication that was both impressive and heartbreaking. "Delia," Miss Whitmore said as they reviewed more of the recordings, "I need to ask you something important. Have you thought about what you want to happen next? Once we share this evidence with the authorities, there's going to be a big investigation, and you and the twins will probably be removed from Mr. Blackwood's home. Do you understand what that means?" Delia nodded solemnly. "I've been thinking about it for weeks. I know that once people know the truth, we can't go back to living there. And I'm scared about what will happen to us, where we'll go. But I'm more scared about what will happen to Jasper and Luna if we don't do anything." The maturity and selflessness of this response nearly brought Miss Whitmore to tears. Here was a 9-year-old child who had weighed the risks and benefits of exposing their abuser with the careful consideration of an experienced investigator, ultimately choosing to prioritize her siblings' safety over her own security and comfort. "What if I told you," Miss Whitmore said carefully, "that there might be a way for you and the twins to stay together in a safe place with someone who understands what you've been through and wants to help you heal?" Delia looked up with an expression of cautious hope. "What do you mean?" Miss Whitmore took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would change her own life as dramatically as it would change the children's. "I mean that I've been thinking about becoming a foster parent for a long time. I grew up in foster care myself after my parents died when I was 7, and I've always wanted to provide the kind of safe, loving home that I didn't always have as a child." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Miss Whitmore's own experiences and her genuine commitment to helping children who had suffered trauma. She spoke about her years moving between foster homes, some loving and supportive, others indifferent or even harmful. She described the loneliness and fear that had characterized much of her childhood, and the teachers and social workers who had made the difference between survival and thriving. "I became a teacher because I wanted to be the kind of adult who notices when children are struggling," she explained. "I wanted to be someone who could provide safety and support for kids who needed it most. And when I started noticing the signs with you and the twins, I began researching what it would take to become a licensed foster parent." Delia listened to these revelations with growing amazement and hope. The idea that her teacher, the one adult who had shown her consistent kindness and respect, might become their permanent guardian seemed almost too good to be true. But Miss Whitmore's sincerity was evident, and her understanding of trauma and foster care gave her explanations a credibility that Delia found deeply reassuring. "The process isn't simple," Miss Whitmore continued honestly. "There would be background checks, home inspections, training courses, and legal proceedings. But I've already started some of the preliminary paperwork, and I have colleagues and friends who can provide references and support." As they talked through the practical implications of this possibility, Miss Whitmore was simultaneously developing a plan for the immediate crisis. The evidence Delia had gathered was more than sufficient to trigger a Child Protective Services investigation, but the process would need to be handled carefully to ensure the children's safety and the preservation of evidence. "Here's what I think we should do," Miss Whitmore said, pulling out her personal cell phone and a legal pad. "First, I'm going to call the Child Abuse Hotline and report what you've shown me. They'll send investigators to interview all of you and examine the evidence. Then I'm going to contact a friend of mine who works for Child Protective Services to make sure your case gets the priority attention it deserves. She explained that the investigation would likely move quickly once authorities heard the recordings, and that the children would probably be removed from Blackwood's home within days. Emergency foster placement would be arranged while the legal process unfolded, and Miss Whitmore would formally request to serve as their foster parent during this transitional period. But most importantly, she said, looking directly into Delia's eyes, I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself, and you don't have to protect Jasper and Luna by yourself. There are adults who are going to help now, and we're going to make sure all three of you are safe. The relief that washed over Delia's face was profound and immediate. For 4 months, she had carried the impossible weight of being the sole protector and advocate for her siblings, documenting their abuse while surviving her own trauma and maintaining the facade of normalcy required by their situation. The opportunity to share that burden with a trusted adult who understood the complexities of their situation felt like the answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Whitmore and Delia worked together to organize the evidence and prepare for the difficult conversations that lay ahead. They reviewed key recordings that would be most compelling to investigators, discussed the timeline of abuse escalation, and prepared Delia for the questions she would be asked during official interviews. Throughout this process, Miss Whitmore was struck by Delia's remarkable resilience and intelligence. Despite everything she had endured, the child remained focused on protecting her siblings and ensuring that justice would be served. Her understanding of legal evidence and investigative procedures was sophisticated beyond her years, and her strategic thinking about the case showed a maturity that was both admirable and heartbreaking. Delia, Miss Whitmore said as they prepared to make the first official phone call, I want you to understand something important. What you've done, gathering this evidence, protecting Jasper and Luna, finding the courage to tell the truth, it's going to save their lives. And probably the lives of other children too, because people like Mr. Blackwood don't usually stop with just one family. As Miss Whitmore dialed the child abuse hotline, Delia felt a mixture of terror and relief that threatened to overwhelm her. The secret she had carried for 4 months was finally being shared with adults who had the power to act on it. The evidence she had risked everything to gather was finally going to see the light of day. And most importantly, Jasper and Luna were finally going to be safe. The phone call itself was professional and efficient, with Miss Whitmore providing the basic details of the situation and arranging for an immediate response from trained investigators. As she spoke with the intake worker, Delia could hear the seriousness in both voices, the recognition that they were dealing with a case of exceptional severity that would require careful handling and urgent action. They're sending a team tonight, Miss Whitmore explained after ending the call. They'll interview you and examine the evidence, and then they'll arrange for you and the twins to be moved to a safe location. I've also called my friend Sarah Chen, who works for CPS, and she's going to personally oversee your case to make sure everything is handled properly. The next few hours passed in a blur of official phone calls, document preparation, and emotional conversation. Miss Whitmore contacted her principal to explain the situation and arrange for substitute coverage, recognizing that the next few days would require her full attention and presence. She also called several personal references who had agreed to support her application to become a foster parent, alerting them that the timeline had accelerated dramatically. As evening approached and they prepared to leave the classroom, Miss Whitmore made one final call to arrange emergency accommodations for the children while the investigation unfolded. Her small apartment wasn't large enough to house 3 additional people, but she had friends in the community who could provide temporary space until more permanent arrangements were established. Delia, she said as they gathered their belongings, I know tonight is going to be difficult and scary. There will be a lot of adults asking you questions, and you'll have to tell your story several times to different people. But I want you to remember that every person you talk to is there to help you and protect Jasper and Luna. As they walked together toward the school's main entrance, Miss Whitmore reflected on the extraordinary courage of the child beside her. In a few hours, Delia would be facing investigators, social workers, and possibly law enforcement officers, sharing the most traumatic experiences of her young life with strangers who would determine the future of her family. But she was doing it willingly, even eagerly, because she understood that it was the only way to save her siblings. The April evening was warm and bright, with the promise of spring evident in the budding trees and blooming flowers that surrounded the school grounds. As they reached Miss Whitmore's car, both teacher and student understood that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The evidence that had been hidden for months would soon be shared with authorities. The truth about Nathaniel Blackwood would finally be revealed, and 3 children would begin the long journey toward healing and safety. "Are you ready?" Miss Whitmore asked as she started the car, though she understood that no one could truly be prepared for what lay ahead. "I've been ready for months," Delia replied, clutching the dictionary that contained the smartphone with its terrible cargo of evidence. "I just needed to find the right person to trust." As they drove toward the Child Protective Services office where investigators were waiting to begin their work, both Delia and Miss Whitmore understood that they had found in each other the support and strength necessary to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The months of silent courage were finally giving way to action, and the process of bringing justice to 3 innocent children was about to begin in earnest. The evidence was compelling, the witnesses were prepared, and the adult support system was in place. All that remained was for the truth to be told, for the recordings to be heard, and for the full weight of the legal system to be brought to bear against a man who had used his wealth and power to torture children in the privacy of his own home. The breaking of silence would soon give way to the breaking of chains, and 3 children who had suffered in isolation would finally find the protection and love they deserved. The Richmond Department of Social Services building stood like a fortress of bureaucracy against the darkening April sky, its concrete facade softened only by the warm glow emanating from windows where dedicated professionals worked late into the evening. As Miss Whitmore's car pulled into the parking lot, Delia could see several official vehicles already present, marked cars from Child Protective Services, an unmarked sedan that probably belonged to a detective, and a van from the Forensic Investigation unit that would be responsible for examining her recordings. The weight of the moment settled over Delia like a heavy blanket as she clutched the dictionary containing her secret weapon. After 4 months of silent documentation and careful planning, she was finally about to share her evidence with people who had the power to act on it. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the terror of what would happen once the truth was revealed. "Remember," Miss Whitmore said gently as they sat in the car for a moment before going inside, "everyone in that building is there to help you and protect Jasper and Luna. You've already done the hardest part by gathering the evidence and finding the courage to speak up. Now it's time to let the adults take over." Delia nodded, though her hands were trembling as she opened the car door. The evening air carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees and the distant sound of traffic, normal springtime sensations that seemed surreal given the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this place. The lobby of the Social Services building was designed to be welcoming and non-threatening, with comfortable seating, child-friendly artwork, and soft lighting that helped ease the anxiety of families in crisis. But despite the careful decor, Delia could feel the weight of official authority in every corner of the space. This was where decisions were made about children's lives, where families were separated and hopefully reunited, where the power of the state was brought to bear on behalf of the vulnerable. Sarah Chen, Miss Whitmore's friend and contact within the Child Protective Services system, met them at the reception desk with a warm smile that immediately put Delia at ease. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of competent authority that suggested years of experience handling complex cases involving endangered children. "You must be Delia," Sarah said, kneeling down to meet the girl at eye level. "Miss Whitmore has told me wonderful things about you, and I want you to know how proud I am of your courage in speaking up to protect your siblings. What you've done is extraordinary." The validation from this trusted adult helped settle some of Delia's nerves, as they were escorted through security and into the building's inner corridors. The walls were lined with photographs of smiling children and families, success stories that served as reminders of the positive outcomes that were possible when the system worked as intended. The conference room where they conducted the initial interview was designed to be as comfortable as possible for children, with child-sized furniture, toys in one corner, and windows that looked out onto a small garden area. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a veteran investigator with the Richmond Police Department's Special Victims Unit, was waiting for them along with 2 other CPS workers and a forensic technician who would be responsible for examining Delia's recordings. "Delia," Detective Rodriguez said with genuine warmth, "I want to thank you for being so brave. I know this is scary, but what you've done, documenting evidence to protect your siblings, shows incredible strength and intelligence. We're going to listen to everything you have to tell us, and we're going to make sure you and Jasper and Luna are safe." The formal interview process began with basic questions about Delia's background, her placement in the Blackwood home, and her relationship with Nathaniel Blackwood and the twins. The investigators were careful to establish a timeline and context for the abuse, understanding that the strength of their case would depend on their ability to present a clear and compelling narrative to prosecutors and eventually to a jury. As Delia recounted the progression of Blackwood's abuse, from the initial psychological manipulation to the escalating physical violence, the investigators took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions designed to clarify specific incidents and establish patterns of behavior. Her responses demonstrated a level of observational skill and memory for detail that impressed even the seasoned professionals in the room. "Now, Delia," Detective Rodriguez said, as they approached the most crucial part of the interview. "Miss, Whitmore tells us that you've been recording some of what's been happening at home. Can you tell us about that?" With trembling hands, Delia retrieved the smartphone from its hiding place in the dictionary and placed it on the conference table. The worn device seemed almost anticlimactic, given the enormous significance of what it contained: 4 months of systematic documentation that could destroy Nathaniel Blackwood's carefully constructed facade and finally bring justice to 3 innocent children. "I found this phone in February," Delia explained, her voice growing steadier as she shifted into the role of teacher, explaining the system she had developed over months of careful work. "I taught myself how to use it to record what was happening to Jasper and Luna. I have over 50 hours of recordings that show exactly what Mr. Blackwood does to them when no one else is around." The forensic technician, a patient woman named Dr. Lisa Park, who specialized in digital evidence analysis, carefully examined the device and began the process of accessing and cataloging its contents. As she worked, she explained to Delia how the recordings would be processed and authenticated to ensure their admissibility in court proceedings. "What you've done here is create a comprehensive archive of evidence," Dr. Park explained with obvious admiration. "The organization, the detailed timestamps, the variety of incident types, this is more thorough than what we usually see from trained investigators. You should be very proud of your work." As the team began reviewing selected recordings, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The casual professionalism that had characterized the early part of the interview gave way to grim determination, as the investigators heard Blackwood's voice delivering calculated psychological torture to 6-year-old children. The sound of the twins' terror and pain, captured with devastating clarity by Delia's hidden phone, provided evidence that was both irrefutable and heartbreaking. Detective Rodriguez, who had investigated hundreds of child abuse cases during her career, found herself struggling to maintain her composure as she listened to Blackwood's methodical destruction of 2 young children's sense of safety and self-worth. The recordings revealed not just isolated incidents of abuse, but a systematic campaign of torture designed to break down the twins' resistance and ensure their absolute compliance with his demands. "Delia," Sarah Chen said after they had reviewed several of the most damaging recordings, "I need you to understand something important. What you've documented here, this evidence you've gathered, It's going to be crucial in making sure Mr. Blackwood can never hurt you or any other children. Again, you've potentially saved lives with your courage. The weight of this responsibility was both empowering and overwhelming for Delia. She had understood that her recordings might help protect Jasper and Luna, but the realization that her evidence could prevent other children from suffering similar abuse added a new dimension to the significance of her work. As the formal interview concluded, the investigators began discussing the immediate next steps. The evidence was more than sufficient to obtain emergency custody orders for all 3 children, and arrangements were already being made to remove them from Blackwood's home that very evening. The timing was critical. They needed to act quickly, before Blackwood became aware of the investigation and potentially destroyed evidence or taken other actions to protect himself. "We're going to execute the custody orders tonight," Detective Rodriguez explained. "A team will go to the Blackwood mansion to collect you and the twins, and you'll be taken to emergency placement while we continue the investigation. Miss Whitmore has volunteered to serve as your temporary guardian, and we're expediting the approval process given the circumstances." The logistics of the operation were complex, requiring coordination between multiple agencies and careful timing to ensure the children's safety. Search warrants were being prepared to allow investigators to examine the mansion for additional evidence, and prosecutors were already reviewing the recordings to determine the specific charges that would be filed against Blackwood. Miss Whitmore, who had been quietly observing the proceedings while providing emotional support for Delia, stepped forward to address the practical concerns about the children's immediate care. Her small apartment was not equipped to house 3 additional people, but she had arranged for temporary accommodations with friends from her church community who had experience caring for traumatized children. "The Martinez family has agreed to let us use their guest house for the next few weeks," Miss Whitmore explained. "They have experience with foster care, and their property is large enough to give the children space to decompress and begin healing. I'll be staying there as well to provide continuity and support during the transition." As the meeting concluded, and preparations began for the evening's operation, Delia found herself caught between relief and anxiety about what lay ahead. The secret she had carried for 4 months was finally being shared with adults who had the power to act on it. But the process of extracting her and the twins from Blackwood's control would be traumatic in its own way. "Are you ready to go home and get Jasper and Luna?" Detective Rodriguez asked gently, understanding that this would be one of the most difficult moments in an already overwhelming day. Delia took a deep breath and nodded. They're going to be so scared when strangers come to take them away from the only home they remember. But they'll be even more scared if we leave them there with Mr. Blackwood after he finds out what I've done. The drive back to the Blackwood mansion took place in a convoy of official vehicles, with Detective Rodriguez and Sarah Chen riding with Delia and Miss Whitmore, while uniformed officers and additional social workers followed in separate cars. The neighborhood streets that Delia had traveled countless times took on a different character in the gathering darkness. Familiar landmarks now serving as waypoints in what would likely be her final journey to the place that had been both home and prison for the past 3 years. As they approached the imposing gates of the mansion, Delia could see lights in the windows of the main living areas, suggesting that Blackwood was home and unaware of the investigation that was about to engulf him. The sight of his Bentley in the circular driveway, flanked by the unmarked vehicles of law enforcement, created a surreal tableau that seemed to symbolize the collision between his carefully constructed world of wealth and privilege and the harsh reality of justice. "Remember," Miss Whitmore said as they prepared to enter the mansion, "you've done everything right, and now the adults are going to take care of the rest. Your job now is just to help Jasper and Luna understand that they're going to be safe." The front door of the mansion opened before they could ring the bell, revealing Nathaniel Blackwood in his usual evening attire of expensive casual wear and an expression of polite curiosity that quickly shifted to alarm as he registered the official nature of his visitors. His eyes immediately sought out Delia, and she could see the calculations beginning behind his facade of confused concern. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," Detective Rodriguez said, displaying her badge and identification. "I'm Detective Rodriguez with the Richmond Police Department, and this is Sarah Chen from Child Protective Services. We have court orders regarding the children in your care. The legal documents were presented with professional efficiency, but Delia could see Blackwood's mind racing as he processed the implications of what was happening. His gaze kept returning to her with increasing intensity, and she could feel the weight of his realization that his carefully maintained secret had been exposed. "I don't understand," Blackwood said, his voice maintaining its usual controlled tone despite the obvious stress he was experiencing. "Is there some kind of misunderstanding? The children are perfectly fine. Delia can tell you." "Mr. Blackwood," Sarah Chen interrupted firmly, "we need to speak with all 3 children immediately, and then we'll be taking them into protective custody while we conduct our investigation. Please step aside and allow us to do our job." The confrontation that followed was brief but intense, with Blackwood attempting to use his wealth and connections to intimidate the investigators while simultaneously trying to gauge how much they knew about his activities. His lawyer was called and arrived within minutes, but the evidence Delia had provided was so compelling that even the most expensive legal representation could not prevent the immediate removal of the children. Jasper and Luna were found huddled together in Luna's room, their small bodies trembling with fear as they listened to the adult voices downstairs. When Delia entered with Detective Rodriguez and Sarah Chen, their relief at seeing their protective older sister was palpable, though they remained terrified of the strangers who had invaded their home. "It's okay," Delia whispered as she gathered them both into her arms. "These are good people who are here to help us. We're going to leave this house and go somewhere safe, where no one will hurt you anymore." The process of explaining the situation to the traumatized 6-year-olds required patience and gentleness from the trained professionals, but Delia's presence and reassurance were crucial in helping them understand that they were being rescued rather than punished. Miss Whitmore's calm authority and obvious care for all 3 children helped establish trust as they prepared to leave the only home the twins clearly remembered. As they packed a few essential belongings, Delia could hear Blackwood in the main hallway, his voice raised in indignation as he spoke with his attorney about the outrageous violation of his rights and the obvious misunderstanding that had led to this investigation. Even now, faced with the collapse of his carefully constructed life, he maintained the arrogant confidence of a man who believed his wealth and status would ultimately protect him from consequences. But Detective Rodriguez and her team had seen the evidence. They had heard the recordings that documented months of systematic torture inflicted on innocent children. They had witnessed Delia's extraordinary courage in gathering that evidence despite the enormous personal risk, and they understood that they were dealing with a predator whose crimes demanded the full force of legal justice. The final moments in the mansion were surreal and emotionally charged, with Blackwood making one last attempt to speak privately with Delia, perhaps hoping to gauge how much she had revealed or to intimidate her into recanting her accusations. But Detective Rodriguez intervened immediately, understanding the psychological dynamics at play and protecting Delia from any further manipulation. "Your relationship with these children is over, Mr. Blackwood," the detective said firmly. "Any further contact will be considered witness intimidation and will result in additional charges." As they loaded the children into the waiting vehicles, Delia took one final look at the mansion that had been both sanctuary and torture chamber for the past 3 years. The imposing facade that had impressed so many visitors now seemed like a monument to deception, its beauty serving only to conceal the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The drive to their temporary housing was quiet, with all 3 children processing the enormity of what had just occurred. Jasper and Luna, who had not spoken above a whisper for months, began to show signs of cautious optimism as they realized that they were truly free from Blackwood's control. Miss Whitmore, sitting beside them in the back seat, provided quiet reassurance and began the process of helping them understand what would happen next. The Martinez family's guest house was small but welcoming, with comfortable furnishings and a sense of safety that none of the children had experienced in many months. As they settled in for their first night of freedom, with Miss Whitmore sleeping in the adjoining room and official protection just a phone call away, Delia finally allowed herself to believe that their nightmare was over. But even as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that the most important part of their journey was still ahead. The trial where her recordings would be played for a judge and jury, where the truth about Nathaniel Blackwood would finally be revealed. In a court of law, and where justice would ultimately be served for 3 children who had suffered in silence for far too long. The evidence was secured, the children were safe, and the legal process was beginning. All that remained was for Delia to find the courage one more time, to stand in a courtroom and tell the world what had happened behind the closed doors of Richmond's most prestigious mansion. 3 months had passed since that pivotal April evening when Delia first broke her silence in Miss Whitmore's classroom, and the Richmond County Courthouse had never seen a case that had captured public attention. Quite like Commonwealth versus Nathaniel Blackwood, the imposing neoclassical building, with its marble columns and soaring dome, had witnessed countless trials over its century-long history. But the case of the 9-year-old girl who had secretly recorded months of abuse had drawn national media coverage and packed the courtroom beyond capacity. The morning of July 15th dawned clear and warm, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that seemed inappropriate for such a somber occasion. Delia sat in the witness preparation room adjacent to the main courtroom, wearing a simple blue dress that Miss Whitmore had helped her choose, something dignified but age-appropriate, professional enough for court, but still clearly the clothing of a child. Her hands were folded in her lap as she reviewed her testimony one final time, the months of preparation and psychological counseling having equipped her with the tools she would need to face her abuser in open court. Catherine Whitmore, now. Officially Delia's foster mother after an expedited approval process that had been facilitated by her exemplary background and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, sat beside her, providing quiet support. The past 3 months in the Martinez family's guest house had been a period of intense healing and legal preparation, with all 3 children receiving specialized trauma counseling while slowly learning to trust in their newfound safety. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Miss Whitmore asked, though she could see the mixture of determination and nervousness written clearly across Delia's young face. "I'm ready," Delia replied, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "I've been ready for this moment since the first time I saw him hurt Jasper and Luna. Today is the day the whole world gets to hear what really happened in that house." Through the preparation room's small window, they could see the media circus that had assembled outside the courthouse. News vans from national networks lined the street, reporters spoke earnestly into cameras, and protesters held signs demanding justice for the Blackwood children. The case had become a symbol of wealth and privilege being used to conceal horrific crimes, and public outrage had been building steadily as details of the abuse had been revealed through pre-trial proceedings. District Attorney Rebecca Morrison entered the room with the confident bearing of a prosecutor who had built her career on complex cases involving crimes against children. At 45, she was known throughout Virginia's legal community for her meticulous preparation and her ability to present evidence in ways that juries could understand and emotionally connect with. The Blackwood case had become the most important of her career, and she understood that its outcome would send a message about whether wealth and status could protect predators from the consequences of their actions. "Delia," Prosecutor Morrison said, sitting down across from the girl, with the same respect she would show an adult witness, "I want to remind you that you've already done the hardest part. You gathered the evidence, you found the courage to speak up, and you've survived everything he put you through. Today is just about telling the truth to 12 people who need to hear it." The prosecutor had spent hours with Delia over the past weeks, helping her prepare for the intense cross-examination she would face from Blackwood's defense team. The girl's composure and intelligence had impressed even veteran court officers, but Morrison understood that facing her abuser in person would test every ounce of courage Delia possessed. "The defense is going to try to make you doubt yourself," Morrison continued, "but I want you to remember that the recordings don't lie. When the jury hears those files, they'll know beyond any doubt that you're telling the truth. Your job is just to explain what you saw and why you decided to document it. As they prepared to enter the courtroom, Detective Rodriguez appeared in the doorway to provide a final update on the morning's developments. The investigation that had begun with Delia's smartphone recordings had expanded dramatically over the past 3 months, revealing evidence of financial crimes, tax evasion, and most disturbing of all, connections to other cases of suspected child abuse in Blackwood's social circle. The forensic analysis of his computers turned up some additional evidence that the jury is going to hear about, Detective Rodriguez explained carefully, not wanting to burden Delia with details that weren't necessary for her testimony. Let's just say that your courage in speaking up has protected more children than you probably realize. The main courtroom was an imposing space designed to emphasize the gravity and solemnity of legal proceedings. Tall windows lined one wall, allowing natural light to illuminate the rich wood paneling and brass fixtures that gave the room its sense of gravitas. The jury box sat to the right of the judge's bench, currently occupied by 12 citizens who had been selected for their ability to remain impartial, despite the extensive media coverage the case had received. Judge Margaret Thornton, a distinguished woman in her 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, had a reputation for running an orderly courtroom while showing appropriate sensitivity to cases involving child witnesses. She had issued strict orders limiting media access and had arranged for special accommodations to help Delia feel as comfortable as possible during her testimony. As Delia entered the courtroom with Miss Whitmore and Prosecutor Morrison, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The gallery was packed with reporters, child advocacy groups, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case through months of pre-trial coverage. But her attention was immediately drawn to the defense table, where Nathaniel Blackwood sat with his team of expensive attorneys. 3 months in jail awaiting trial had changed Blackwood's appearance significantly. Gone was the polished executive in designer suits, replaced by a man whose orange prison jumpsuit and shackled hands made his fall from grace unmistakably clear. But his eyes remained the same, cold, calculating, and filled with the barely contained rage of a predator who had been caged. When their gazes met across the courtroom, Delia felt a familiar chill of fear that transported her back to the mansion where he had wielded absolute power over her life and the lives of the twins. But the emotion lasted only a moment, before being replaced by a steely determination born from months of healing and the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her fight against him. At the prosecution table, a sophisticated audio-visual system had been set up to play the recordings that would serve as the centerpiece of the state's case. The equipment looked almost mundane in the formal setting of the courthouse, giving no indication of the explosive evidence it contained. Over 50 hours of systematically documented child abuse that would provide an unprecedented window into the private crimes of a wealthy predator. Your Honor, Prosecutor Morrison began as she rose to address the court. The Commonwealth calls Delia Caldwell to the witness stand. The walk from the gallery to the witness box felt like the longest journey of Delia's life, though it covered only a few dozen feet. Every step was observed by the packed courtroom, every movement captured by the sketch artists who would immortalize this moment for the evening news broadcasts that would carry the story across the nation. The witness stand itself was an imposing piece of furniture, elevated above the courtroom floor and positioned to ensure that the witness could be seen clearly by judge, jury, and attorneys. As Delia took her place and was sworn in by the court clerk, she could see Miss Whitmore in the front row of the gallery, providing silent encouragement with her presence and supportive smile. "Please state your name for the record," Prosecutor Morrison began gently. "Delia Marie Caldwell," she replied, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's excellent acoustics. "And how old are you, Delia?" "I'm 9 years old. I'll be 10 in November." The prosecutor's opening questions were designed to establish Delia's background and to help the jury understand the context of her relationship with Nathaniel Blackwood. She explained how she had come to live in his mansion after her parents' death in a car accident, her initial hopes that she had found a loving home. and her growing realization that the man who had presented himself as her savior was actually a calculating predator. "Delia," Prosecutor Morrison said as they approached the crucial part of her testimony, "I want you to tell the jury about your foster siblings, Jasper and Luna." "They're 6 years old and they're twins," Delia explained, her voice growing stronger as she talked about the children she had worked so hard to protect. "They came to live with Mr. Blackwood about 8 months after I did. At first, they were like normal kids. They laughed and played and asked lots of questions. But after a few weeks, they started to change. Can you describe how they changed? They became really quiet and scared all the time. They stopped talking except to each other and only in whispers. They would flinch if adults came near them, and they started having nightmares every night. Luna stopped talking completely after a few months." As Delia continued her testimony, describing the systematic transformation of 2 happy children into traumatized shadows of their former selves, the courtroom remained absolutely silent. The jury members leaned forward in their seats, their faces reflecting growing horror as they began to understand the scope of what had occurred in Blackwood's mansion. "Delia," the prosecutor continued, "did you witness Mr. Blackwood harming Jasper and Luna?" "Yes, many times. He would hurt them physically, but he was very careful not to leave marks where people could see them. And he would say terrible things to them, trying to make them feel worthless and grateful at the same time. Can you give the jury an example of what you witnessed?" Delia took a deep breath, steeling herself to recount some of the most traumatic memories from her time in the mansion. "One night in February, Luna refused to eat her vegetables at dinner. Most parents would just say no dessert or something like that. But Mr. Blackwood took her to the living room and beat her with his belt for almost 10 minutes, while Jasper and I had to watch. The impact of this simple, matter-of-fact description was immediate and profound. Several jury members visibly recoiled, and one woman covered her mouth with her hand, as if to stifle a gasp. The contrast between Delia's calm, composed delivery and the horrific content of her testimony made her account even more powerful and believable. "What did you do when you witnessed this abuse?" Prosecutor Morrison asked. "At first, I didn't know what to do," Delia admitted. "I was scared that if I told anyone, no one would believe me because Mr. Blackwood is so rich and famous. And I was scared that if I tried to help Jasper and Luna, he would hurt them even worse." "So what did you decide to do?" "I decided I needed proof. I needed evidence that adults would have to believe, even if they didn't want to. So I found an old phone and started recording what was happening." This was the moment that Prosecutor Morrison had been building toward throughout the entire opening portion of Delia's testimony. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as she approached the table where the audio equipment had been carefully prepared. "Delia, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Commonwealth's Exhibit A. Can you identify this device?" Delia looked at the smartphone that had been her secret weapon for 4 months, now sealed in an evidence bag and officially authenticated by forensic experts. "That's the phone I found and used to record Mr. Blackwood abusing Jasper and Luna." "And how many recordings did you make with this device?" "Over 50 hours, spread across 4 months. I recorded everything I could, whenever I could do it safely." Prosecutor Morrison returned to her table and activated the audio system that would play selected excerpts from Delia's archive. The technical setup had been tested multiple times to ensure optimal sound quality, and the courtroom's acoustics had been optimized to ensure that every word would be heard clearly by the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor announced solemnly, "you are about to hear evidence that was gathered by this 9-year-old child at tremendous personal risk to herself and her siblings. I must warn you that the content is disturbing and may be difficult to listen to. However, it is crucial that you hear it in order to understand the full scope of the crimes committed against these children." The first recording began to play, and the courtroom was immediately filled with Nathaniel Blackwood's voice, captured with devastating clarity as he psychologically tortured 2 6-year-old children. The contrast between his public persona and his private cruelty was staggering. Here was the same man who had been photographed at charity galas and featured in magazine articles about successful philanthropy, revealed as a calculating predator who derived pleasure from the systematic destruction of innocent children. "You live in a mansion that most families could never dream of affording." Blackwood's recorded voice filled the courtroom, his tone coldly conversational as he berated the terrified twins. "You have trust funds that will make you wealthy for life. You attend the finest schools, eat the finest food, wear the finest clothes. And yet you choose to embarrass me with your ungrateful behavior." The sound of the children's terrified whimpers and Jasper's desperate pleas for mercy created an atmosphere in the courtroom that was almost unbearable. Several jury members were visibly struggling to maintain their composure, and one elderly man had tears streaming down his face as he listened to the evidence of systematic child torture. But it was the sound of Delia's own quiet sobs, barely audible in the background as she recorded her siblings' suffering, that provided the most heartbreaking element of the audio evidence. Here was a 9-year-old child forced to witness and document horrors that would traumatize seasoned investigators, carrying the impossible burden of being both victim and chronicler of unspeakable crimes. The prosecutor played several more excerpts, each one revealing different aspects of Blackwood's systematic abuse. There were recordings of gratitude sessions, where the twins were forced to express appreciation for their luxurious lifestyle, while being psychologically tormented. There were audio files capturing physical punishment sessions, where Blackwood's careful technique for inflicting maximum pain without visible injury was clearly documented. And perhaps most disturbing of all, there were recordings of the coaching sessions, where he trained the children to lie to teachers and other adults about their home situation. "When your teacher asks how you're feeling, what do you say?" Blackwood's voice demanded from the courtroom speakers. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking," came Jasper's hollow, programmed response. "More enthusiasm. You sound like a robot." Again. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking." The forced brightness in the 6-year-old's voice, desperately trying to meet his abuser's expectations, was perhaps the most chilling element of all the evidence presented. As the final recording concluded, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. The impact of hearing Blackwood's crimes in his own voice, captured through months of systematic documentation by a child who had risked everything to protect her siblings, was overwhelming for everyone present. Even the defense attorneys, who had spent months preparing to challenge the evidence, sat in stunned recognition of its devastating power. Judge Thornton called for a brief recess to allow the jury and courtroom observers to process what they had just heard. During the break, Delia remained on the witness stand, with a victim advocate beside her, while Miss Whitmore was allowed to approach and provide quiet encouragement. "You're doing perfectly," Miss Whitmore whispered. "The hardest part is over. Everyone in this room now knows the truth about what happened to you and the twins." When court reconvened, the cross-examination by Blackwood's defense team was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. The lead defense attorney, James Wellington, was one of the most expensive criminal lawyers in Virginia, but even his considerable skills could not overcome the overwhelming evidence that Delia had gathered. His attempts to portray her as a troubled child who had misinterpreted normal parental discipline fell flat in the face of 50 hours of recorded torture. "Miss Caldwell," Wellington began his cross-examination, "isn't it true that you were angry with Mr. Blackwood for establishing rules and expectations in his household?" "No," Delia replied calmly. "I was scared of him because he was torturing my little brother and sister. But you've admitted that Mr. Blackwood provided you with an expensive education, a beautiful home, and financial security. Doesn't that suggest that he cared about your welfare? Someone who cares about children doesn't beat them with belts and make them practice lying to teachers about being happy." Wellington's continued attempts to undermine Delia's credibility only served to reinforce her remarkable composure and intelligence. Her responses were clear, consistent, and delivered with a maturity that made her even more credible to the jury. Most importantly, her answers always directed attention back to the recorded evidence, which spoke more powerfully than any testimony possibly could. "Miss Caldwell," Wellington tried one final approach. How can this jury be certain that these recordings haven't been altered or manipulated in some way? Because I'm not smart enough to fake 50 hours of Mr. Blackwood's voice saying terrible things to children, Delia replied with devastating simplicity. And because the FBI experts already testified that the recordings are real and haven't been changed. As the cross-examination concluded, and Delia was finally allowed to step down from the witness stand, the courtroom erupted in sustained applause. The Judge Thornton allowed to continue for several moments before calling for order. The 9-year-old girl who had endured months of systematic abuse while secretly documenting evidence to protect her siblings had just delivered testimony that would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in the courthouse's long history. The remainder of the trial proceeded with additional witnesses and evidence, but the outcome was never really in doubt after Delia's testimony and the playing of her recordings. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of the abuse on the children. Forensic specialists confirmed the authenticity of the evidence, and other victims came forward to describe similar patterns of behavior by Blackwood in different contexts. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: child abuse, child endangerment, witness intimidation, and several related charges that had emerged from the expanded investigation. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and their revulsion at the crimes that had been committed against innocent children. During the sentencing phase, Prosecutor Morrison played one final recording that Delia had made, not of abuse but of Jasper and Luna comforting each other after one of their worst nights in the mansion. The sound of 2 traumatized 6-year-olds whispering reassurances to each other, trying to find hope and safety in a world that had offered them only cruelty, brought tears to the eyes of hardened court officers and provided a powerful reminder of the human cost of Blackwood's crimes. Judge Thornton sentenced Nathaniel Blackwood to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the systematic nature of his abuse, his exploitation of his position of authority, and the particular vulnerability of his victims. In her sentencing remarks, she specifically praised Delia's courage and intelligence, noting that her actions had not only saved her siblings, but had also protected other potential victims, and provided a model for how children in similar situations might find the strength to seek help. "Miss Caldwell," Judge Thornton said, addressing Delia directly from the bench, "your courage in gathering evidence and speaking truth to power has been extraordinary. You have shown that even the youngest voice, when armed with truth and determination, can challenge the most powerful forces of corruption and cruelty. Your actions have undoubtedly saved lives and will serve as an inspiration to others who face similar challenges." As the courtroom began to empty and the media assembled outside to capture the historic moment, Delia found herself surrounded by the people who had become her new family. Miss Whitmore, now officially her adoptive mother, wrapped her in a protective embrace while Detective Rodriguez and Prosecutor Morrison offered their congratulations and continued support. Jasper and Luna, who had been staying with specialized foster families during the trial to shield them from the media attention, were brought to the courthouse for a reunion that was both joyful and emotional. The twins, now speaking freely and showing signs of remarkable recovery, ran to their sister with the uninhibited affection of children who knew they were finally, permanently safe. "Is the bad man ever going to hurt us again?" Luna asked, speaking clearly for the first time in over a year. "Never," Delia replied with absolute certainty. "He's going to prison for a very long time, and we're going to live with Miss Whitmore, who loves us and will keep us safe forever." 6 months later, on a crisp November morning that happened to be Delia's 10th birthday, the 3 children sat in the kitchen of Miss Whitmore's expanded home. A modest but comfortable house that had been purchased with funds from a victim compensation program and donations from supporters who had followed their story. The walls were decorated with drawings the twins had made in art therapy, photographs from family outings to parks and museums, and Delia's academic awards from her new school. Miss Whitmore, now legally Catherine Caldwell after her adoption, of all 3 children had been finalized, was preparing birthday pancakes while humming softly to herself. She had left her teaching position to focus full-time on helping the children heal from their trauma, but she remained involved in child advocacy work and frequently spoke at conferences about recognizing signs of abuse in educational settings. "Delia," Jasper said as they waited for breakfast, "do you ever think about the recordings anymore?" "Sometimes," she replied honestly, "but not in a scary way. I think about how brave we all were, and how the recordings helped make sure that Mr. Blackwood could never hurt anyone else." The smartphone that had contained their evidence was now locked away in police storage, its contents preserved as part of the permanent legal record. But its impact extended far beyond the conviction of one wealthy predator. The case had led to new training programs for teachers and social workers, improved protocols for investigating child abuse in affluent families, and enhanced legal protections for children who came forward with evidence of abuse. Most importantly, it had sent a clear message that wealth and status could not protect those who preyed upon the innocent, and that even the youngest victims possessed the power to seek justice when armed with truth and courage. As the family gathered around the breakfast table to celebrate Delia's birthday, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. A year ago, she had been a single teacher, growing increasingly concerned about 3 troubled students. Today, she was the mother of 3 remarkable children who had survived unimaginable trauma and emerged with their capacity for love and trust intact. "What's the best birthday present you've ever received?" Catherine asked as she served the pancakes. Delia looked around the table at Jasper and Luna, their faces bright with genuine happiness for the first time in over a year. And then, at Catherine, the woman who had provided them with the safety and love they had desperately needed. "This," she said simply, gesturing to encompass their small family and their modest but secure home. "Having a real family where no one gets hurt and everyone gets to be happy. That's the best present anyone could ever ask for." The story of the 9-year-old girl who had secretly recorded months of abuse to protect her siblings had captured international attention and inspired changes in child protection laws across multiple states. But for Delia, Jasper, Luna, and Catherine, the most important victory was the quiet one they celebrated every day, the simple joy of being safe, being loved, and being together in a home where childhood was finally allowed to flourish.